The Haunting of Hollow Creek Manor. Our story began when Emily and I decided to move to Hollow Creek Manor. We were seeking a fresh start. The manor, a sprawling estate nestled in the countryside, seemed like the perfect escape from our hectic city life. The house was old, with ivy-covered walls and a grand, but slightly eerie entrance. We were enchanted by its charm and the promise of tranquility. Little did we know, we were about to uncover a darkness that would test our very sanity. Our first few nights in the manor were peaceful, almost idyllic. The moonlight cast a silvery glow through the tall, arched windows, and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves. But as the days passed, odd things began to happen. It started with the lights flickering inexplicably and strange drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. Emily brushed it off as the quirks of an old house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. One night, as I was finishing up some work in my study, I heard a soft, mournful whisper. It was faint, but unmistakably there. I called out to Emily, but she was already asleep. I searched the house, but found nothing unusual. I chalked it up to my imagination playing tricks on me, but the whispers continued, growing more distinct each night. Emily began to feel it too. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced she'd heard footsteps outside our bedroom door. She'd find me asleep, unaware of the disturbances. The stress of moving and adjusting to our new life seemed to be taking a toll on both of us, but the whispers grew louder and more persistent. One evening, while exploring the attic, I discovered a dusty old trunk. Inside were faded photographs, letters, and an old journal. The journal belonged to a woman named Eleanor Holloway, who had lived in the manor in the late 1800s. Her entries spoke of loneliness, sorrow, and an impending sense of doom. The last entry was chilling. "I fear they are coming for me. I must find a way to escape this place." Determined to uncover the truth, I began researching the history of Hollow Creek Manor. I learned that Eleanor Holloway had been the victim of a tragic betrayal. Her fiancé, a wealthy landowner, had abandoned her for another woman. Heartbroken, Eleanor had been confined to the manor, where she eventually died under mysterious circumstances. Locals whispered that her spirit remained trapped within the house, unable to find peace. Emily and I were unsettled by the discovery, but we hoped that understanding the past might help us address the disturbances. We decided to hold a séance, hoping to communicate with the spirit and offer it some form of resolution. We set up candles and arranged the room in a manner described in the old journal. As the séance progressed, the atmosphere grew colder. The candles flickered, and the room was filled with a palpable sense of dread. Emily and I held hands, trying to focus on the task at hand. Suddenly, the temperature dropped drastically, and a gust of icy wind blew through the room. We heard a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Help me!" The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was both heart-wrenching and terrifying. I felt a cold hand brush against mine, and Emily let out a gasp. The room grew darker, and the whispers became a cacophony of anguish. The candles extinguished, plunging us into darkness. We scrambled to light them again, but the cold and the whispers persisted. In a moment of clarity, I realized that Eleanor's spirit was not malevolent but trapped and in pain. She needed our help to find peace. We began to speak to her, offering her words of comfort and empathy. We recited the names of those who had wronged her, expressing our sorrow for the injustices she had suffered. The atmosphere gradually shifted. The whispers became softer, more like a gentle sigh. The coldness receded, and the room felt lighter. We felt a sense of calm wash over us. After the séance, the disturbances in the manor ceased. The whispers stopped, and the atmosphere in the house returned to a more serene state. Emily and I continued living in Hollow Creek Manor, but the experience left an indelible mark on us. We often think back to that night, to the sorrowful spirit we encountered, and to the strange but beautiful connection we made with the past. The manor, once a place of fear and unease, became a symbol of reconciliation and peace. Our journey at Hollow Creek Manor taught us that sometimes the past lingers in ways we can't always see, and that understanding and empathy can bridge the gap between the living and the departed. It all started as a simple dare, the kind of thing that teenagers do when they're bored and looking for a thrill. Ravencroft House was infamous in our small town, the kind of place that parents warned their children to stay away from. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, standing alone at the end of a long, narrow road, its windows shattered, and its once grand facade now crumbling. For years, there had been rumors about what happened there. Some said it was haunted by the spirit of a woman who had been brutally murdered. Others claimed it was cursed, that anyone who stepped inside would be marked for death. We never believed any of it. We were just kids, after all, looking for something to do on a warm summer night. Come on, Matt. What's the worst that could happen? Jake, my best friend, was always the instigator. He had that mischievous grin that made it hard to say no, even when you knew you should. Yeah, Matt, don't be a chicken, Sarah chimed in, nudging me playfully. She was the bravest of us all, never one to back down from a challenge. I glanced at the house, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. The wind rustled through the overgrown trees surrounding it, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I didn't want to go in, but I also didn't want to be the only one who chickened out. Fine, I muttered, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But we're not staying long. Just long enough to prove we're not afraid, Jake said, already leading the way. The four of us, Jake, Sarah, my younger sister Emily, and I, approached the house with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The front door was hanging off its hinges, creaking as it swayed in the breeze. Jake pushed it open with a dramatic flourish, and we stepped inside. The interior was even more decrepit than the outside. The floorboards creaked under our feet, and the air was thick with dust. Moonlight filtered through the broken windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. It was exactly the kind of place that would give anyone the creeps, but we were determined to prove we weren't scared. We explored the ground floor first, finding little more than empty rooms and old furniture covered in sheets. The only sound was the occasional drip of water from a leaky roof and the distant hoot of an owl. "This is boring," Emily said after a while. She was younger than the rest of us, but just as eager to prove herself. "Let's go upstairs," Jake suggested, already heading for the staircase. The stairs groaned under our weight as we climbed to the second floor. The hallway was narrow, with doors lining both sides. Most of them were closed, but one door at the end of the hall was ajar, and a faint light flickered from within. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered, stopping in her tracks. "See what?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "I thought I saw something move in there," she said, pointing to the open door. Jake laughed. "Probably just a rat. Come on, let's check it out." Reluctantly, we followed him down the hall. The door creaked as Jake pushed it open, revealing what must have once been a bedroom. The wallpaper was peeling, and the floor was littered with debris. But what caught our attention was the large mirror hanging on the wall opposite the bed. It was an antique, with an ornate frame that had once been gilded but was now tarnished. The glass was cracked, but it still reflected the room in eerie detail. As we approached it, I felt an inexplicable sense of unease. "There's something weird about that mirror," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before I could respond, the flickering light we had seen earlier suddenly intensified. It wasn't coming from the mirror but from behind it, as if there was another room on the other side of the wall. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, reaching out to touch the mirror. His hand passed right through it, as if it wasn't there at all. We all gasped in unison. It was as if the mirror wasn't a mirror at all, but a portal to another place. Jake, ever the thrill-seeker, didn't hesitate. He stepped through the mirror and disappeared. "Jake!" I shouted, but there was no response. Without thinking, I grabbed Emily's hand and followed him through the mirror. Sarah was right behind us. We emerged into a room that was identical to the one we had just left, but it felt different, colder, darker. Jake was standing in the center of the room, staring at something on the floor. As we approached, I realized with a jolt of horror what it was. A body, partially decayed, its eyes wide open in an expression of terror. "Oh my God!" Emily whispered, clinging to me. Who is that?" Sarah stammered, backing away. "I don't know," Jake said, his voice trembling. "But we need to get out of here." We turned to leave, but the mirror was gone. In its place was a solid wall. We were trapped. Panic set in as we realized there was no way out. We searched the room frantically, but there were no doors, no windows, nothing but the four walls and the body on the floor. "This isn't possible," I muttered, trying to stay calm. "We came through the mirror. It has to be here somewhere." But no matter how hard we looked, there was no trace of the mirror. It was as if it had never existed. "What are we going to do?" Emily asked, her voice quivering with fear. "We'll find a way out," I said, trying to reassure her. "There has to be another way." As we continued to search the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and every shadow seemed to move of its own accord. I could feel something malevolent lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, the room was filled with a low, guttural growl. It reverberated through the walls, making the floorboards vibrate beneath our feet. We froze, our eyes darting around the room, trying to find the source of the sound. And then we saw it, a dark figure emerging from the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, with long, bony fingers and hollow eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural light. It moved toward us with slow, deliberate steps, its presence filling the room with a suffocating sense of dread. "Run!" Jake shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The figure reached out its hand, and I felt a cold, icy grip around my throat. I gasped for air, but it was as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. My vision blurred, and I could feel myself slipping into unconsciousness. But just as suddenly as it had begun, the grip released. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The figure was gone, and the room was silent once more. What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I said, my throat raw. "But we need to get out of here. Now." We gathered our wits and began searching the room again, but there was still no sign of an exit. The walls were solid, the floor unyielding. It was as if we were trapped in a nightmare, with no way to escape. As the hours passed, our hope began to fade. We were tired, hungry, and terrified, with no idea how to get out of this hellish place. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on us, and I could see the fear in Emily's eyes. "We're going to die here," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No, we're not," I said, pulling her into a hug. "We're going to find a way out. I promise." But even as I said the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. As we continued our search, we stumbled upon an old, leather-bound journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The pages were yellowed with age, and the ink was faded, but it was still legible. It belonged to a woman named Margaret Ravenscroft, the original owner of the house. As I read through the entries, a chilling story began to unfold. Margaret had been married to a man named Charles, who was wealthy and influential in the town. But their marriage was far from happy. Charles was a cruel and abusive man, and Margaret lived in constant fear of him. One night, in a fit of rage, Charles had murdered Margaret, stabbing her repeatedly before hiding her body in the walls of the house. Her spirit, filled with rage and sorrow, had been trapped in the house ever since, haunting anyone who dared to enter. The journal also mentioned the mirror, describing it as a portal to the spirit world, a gateway that allowed the dead to communicate with the living. But it also warned of the dangers. Once you passed through the mirror, there was no guarantee you could return. As I read the final entry, I realized the gravity of our situation. The mirror had trapped us in Margaret's world, a place where her rage and sorrow had twisted reality into something dark and terrifying. "We need to find a way to communicate with her," I said, closing the journal. "Maybe if we can help her find peace, she'll let us go." "But how do we do that?" Jake asked, his voice filled with doubt. "We have to find her body," I replied, my mind racing. "If we can give her a proper burial, maybe it will release her spirit." "But the house is huge," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "How will we ever find it?" I thought back to the journal, trying to remember any clues. "She said it was hidden in the walls," I said slowly. "We need to look for a section of the wall that doesn't match the rest." We began searching the room, tapping on the walls, listening for any hollow sounds. It was painstaking work, and with every passing minute, I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on us. But finally, in the far corner of the room, we found it. A section of the wall that sounded different, hollow. Jake and I worked together to pry the boards loose. As we pulled them away, a foul stench filled the air, and I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve. Behind the boards, we found a small, dark space, and inside, wrapped in decaying fabric, was a skeletal figure, Margaret Ravenscroft. Emily gasped, and Sarah turned away, unable to look. But I knew we had to continue. We carefully removed the remains from the wall and placed them in the center of the room. "Margaret Ravenscroft," I said, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "We're here to give you the peace you deserve. You don't have to suffer anymore." There was a moment of silence, and then the room grew colder. I could feel her presence, a sadness so profound it made my heart ache. But there was also a glimmer of hope, as if she was reaching out to us. We found an old blanket and wrapped her remains, then carried them down the stairs and out of the house. The night air was cool and refreshing after the oppressive atmosphere inside, and for the first time I felt like we might actually make it out alive. We buried Margaret in the garden under a large oak tree. As we covered her remains with earth, I whispered a prayer, hoping it would help her spirit find peace. When we finished, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the oak tree. It felt like a sign, a final farewell from Margaret. The house, which had once loomed so dark and threatening, now seemed almost peaceful, as if it had been freed from the curse that had plagued it for so long. We left Ravencroft House that night, vowing never to return. As we walked away, I glanced back one last time. The house was quiet, its windows dark, and I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a lingering sense of unease. Years have passed since that night at Ravencroft House. We never spoke of what happened there, not to our families, not to our friends. It was a secret we kept, a shared trauma that bound us together in ways that words could never describe. But the experience changed us. We became closer, more protective of each other. We learned to appreciate the things we had taken for granted: the safety of our homes, the warmth of our families, the simple joy of living without fear. Every now and then, I think about Margaret Ravenscroft and the life she led. I wonder if she found the peace she was searching for, if her spirit finally moved on to whatever comes after this life. I hope she did. Ravencroft House still stands, though no one dares to go near it. The townspeople say it's haunted, that strange noises can be heard at night, and that sometimes, if you're quiet enough, you can see a figure standing at the window, watching, waiting. But I know the truth. Margaret is gone, and the house, while still old and abandoned, is just that, a house. It's a place where terrible things happened, but also a place where we found the strength to face our fears and overcome them. And that, more than anything, is what I take away from that night. It wasn't just a story about ghosts or curses. It was a story about survival, about facing the darkness within and coming out the other side stronger. But still, on quiet nights when the wind howls through the trees, I sometimes think I hear her voice, a soft whisper on the breeze, saying thank you. When I first arrived at the old Miller farm, it seemed like the perfect retreat from the relentless pace of city life. Nestled in the heartland of the Midwest, the farmhouse stood as a picturesque relic from another era. Its wooden beams, weathered by time, and the overgrown fields surrounding it gave it a rustic charm that was hard to resist. What I didn't realize was that beneath this tranquil exterior lay a dark and unsettling history. The first few nights were peaceful, with only the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. But then, as if stirred by my presence, the house began to reveal its true nature. It started with the small things. My keys disappearing from the kitchen counter, only to reappear in a different room, or the faint, inexplicable sound of footsteps echoing through the empty halls. One particularly stormy night, as lightning cast eerie shadows across the walls, the power went out. I fumbled through the dark to retrieve a flashlight from my bedroom. The house was silent, save for the howling wind outside. As I made my way down the stairs, the oppressive darkness seemed to press in on me, making each step feel heavier than the last. Suddenly, I heard it, a soft, distant sound that resembled children's laughter. It was peculiar, considering there were no children in the vicinity. I followed the sound to the old playroom, which had long since been abandoned. The room was cold, and a shiver ran down my spine as I noticed the once vibrant toys now covered in dust. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. That night, as I lay in bed trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread, I was jolted awake by a chilling sensation. The air around me felt unnaturally cold, and I could hear the faint murmur of voices. My flashlight flickered as I turned it on, and for a brief moment, I saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. The apparition was a woman in old-fashioned clothing, her eyes hollow and mournful. Paralyzed by fear, I tried to speak, asking if she needed help. Her gaze remained vacant, and she slowly dissipated into the shadows. The experience left me shaken, and the feeling of being watched persisted. I began to experience more disturbing phenomena, objects moving on their own, and the sensation of being touched by unseen hands. The haunting reached its peak when my dog, usually so calm, began to bark incessantly at an empty corner of the living room. Desperate for answers, I reached out to the local historical society, only to discover that the farm had been the site of a tragic accident involving a family of 4. Their deaths were sudden and unexplained, and it was said that their spirits were bound to the land. I couldn't stay in the farmhouse any longer. The fear was overwhelming, and the atmosphere was thick with an oppressive energy. The old Miller farm became a place of nightmares, and as I left it behind, I knew that its haunted past would forever be etched in my memory. I never ever went back again. The Abandoned Asylum. This is a short story, but one that will stay with me for my entire life. Volunteering at the abandoned Wexford Asylum was supposed to be a chance to contribute to historical preservation. The asylum, with its foreboding Gothic architecture and a history steeped in scandal, had been closed for decades. The stories of inhumane treatments and dark experiments were notorious, but I was drawn to the project out of a fascination with the past. The first few days of working at the asylum were surprisingly mundane. The building was as eerie as expected, with peeling paint and rusting metalwork. But it wasn't until the third night, when I stayed behind to document the site alone, that the true nature of the asylum revealed itself. As night fell, the asylum took on an even more sinister atmosphere. The temperature dropped significantly, and I felt a persistent chill that seemed to seep through my bones. The dim light from my flashlight barely penetrated the darkness as I moved through the corridors. The silence was occasionally broken by the distant echo of my own footsteps, which seemed unnaturally loud. While exploring the infirmary wing, I was startled by a sudden, oppressive weight on my chest. It felt as though invisible hands were gripping me tightly, making it difficult to breathe. My flashlight flickered erratically, casting fleeting shadows that danced on the walls. When the light stabilized, I saw her. A ghostly figure of a nurse, her face contorted in anguish. She seemed to be trapped in a cycle of sorrow, her spectral form moving with a slow, deliberate grace. I tried to approach her, but she vanished as soon as I drew near. My heart raced as I stumbled out of the infirmary, only to be greeted by more unsettling phenomena. Shadows flitted across my path, and the whispers of long-forgotten patients seemed to swirl around me. In a desperate attempt to understand what I was experiencing, I searched the asylum's records. I discovered a letter from a former patient, detailing the horrors of the asylum's experiments and pleading for release. The letter's haunting descriptions matched the feelings I had encountered. The experience left me profoundly disturbed. The asylum, with its history of suffering, seemed to be a place where the echoes of the past were trapped, endlessly replaying their torment. The building's presence was so overpowering that I could no longer remain. The echoes of the abandoned asylum continued to haunt my dreams, a constant reminder of the dark history that lingered within its walls. Wexford Manor. Inheriting Wexford Manor was a stroke of unexpected luck. The grand estate, with its sprawling grounds and historical charm, seemed like a dream come true. However, the manor had been unoccupied for years, and as I settled in, I soon discovered that its grandeur was matched by an unsettling past. The manor's size and the eerie quiet of its vast rooms made it both awe-inspiring and intimidating. I spent the first few days unpacking and exploring, marveling at the intricate woodwork and antique furnishings. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere shifted. The manor, once a majestic sanctuary, now felt like a stage for something far more sinister. It started with the piano. I would hear a soft, melancholic melody drifting through the hallways late at night. There was no piano in the house, and I couldn't find any source for the music. My curiosity turned to unease as the melody grew more persistent and mournful. One night, driven by a mix of fascination and dread, I followed the sound to the grand ballroom. The room was bathed in moonlight, and the music seemed to emanate from the shadows. As I entered, I saw her, a ghostly figure in an elegant gown, twirling gracefully as if lost in a dance from another time. Her face was filled with sorrow, and as she noticed me, she slowly faded away, leaving behind a cold, heavy silence. Over the following nights, the manor seemed to come alive with spectral activity. Figures from different eras appeared and vanished with alarming frequency. Each apparition seemed to be reenacting scenes from their lives, their faces etched with unfulfilled desires and unresolved regrets. One night, the music reached a crescendo, leading me to a hidden compartment in the ballroom. Inside, I found a letter written in elegant script, dated from the early 20th century. It was a love letter from a woman to her fiancé, who had gone off to war and never returned. The letter spoke of her undying hope and longing, her promise to wait for him forever. The letter explained that she had died in the manor, unable to leave her promise unfulfilled. As I read the letter, the room grew colder, and I felt the presence of the woman's sorrowful spirit all around me. The manor, it seemed, was bound by her promise and the unresolved stories of those who had lived and died there. Unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere, I eventually left Wexford Manor behind. The haunting melodies and the tragic figures would remain with me, a chilling reminder of the lives once lived within those walls and the spirits that continue to linger, trapped by their own pasts. Thanks for listening. Like and subscribe for part 2. And make sure you locked your doors. See you next time.